Okay, so good morning, everyone. Get your cup of coffee, and I'm going to try to walk through a little discussion of dissociation and psychosis this morning. So what I'm going to try to cover this morning is to help us think about dissociation and unusual experiences on a continuum, like we do with a lot of the CBT kind of constructs, and then talk a little bit about some models looking at the link between trauma, dissociation, and psychosis, how they might go together, and then think about it a little bit differently, a little bit more on the compassion-focused therapy approach, where we look at voice hearing as kind of a self-protective strategy. I'm not going to go into treatment stuff too much, just a teeny bit, but mostly to kind of lay out some of the ways that this may be connected. So I first became curious about this working with our clinical high-risk team. They reported that a number of the folks on the team were having depersonalization and derealization experiences and wanted us to talk about dissociation a little bit. So I went back to one of the texts, the Van der Gogh text, and they classify these things as unusual, extraordinary experiences. And within that, there's the kind of typical, hearing voices or a sensory experience not otherwise there. But a couple of the items were specifically kind of dissociative, the depersonalization and derealization. Of course, ideas of reference, thinking things have a special meaning, which can feel a bit unreal as well. So there seemed to be a little bit of a dissociative subcategory potentially there. And so wanted to explore that a little bit. So I began to look at a little bit of the research on dissociation. What is dissociation? So if we look at the DSM, it's a disruption or discontinuity in the usually integrated functions of, and then you go down the list, consciousness, memory, identity, emotion, perception, body representation, motor control, behavior. So the assumption is that we're normally sort of integrated. We have an awareness, things are integrated, we kind of follow time sequence, we have kind of a flow of things that go with it. Dissociation disrupts that. And so it's often a felt sense of a disconnect of this integrated awareness. I like to use the word surreal. When you have a surreal sort of feeling, there's a bit of a dissociation flavor to that. So looking at some of the literature, it became clearer that dissociation is common and does kind of fall on a continuum if you go from the starting point of disruption of this integration of our various executive functions. And it kind of thinking about dealing with moments of time, why would it make sense for us to sometimes disconnect or disengage? And there seems to be some benefits to doing this. When we think about the childhood literature, when we think about play, imagination, and fantasy, where our brain disconnects from a task and gets immersed in fantasy, there's something about that as kind of developmental and healthy. It reminded me when I was in school, I used to imagine that the school was kind of a spaceship and my desk was sort of like I was in the captain chair. So that was my little bit of imagination disconnect from the harsh reality of school, trying to deal with all the experiences within school. I can kind of disconnect. There's also benefits if you think about like taking long trips when you're driving, you kind of get an automatic mode, you kind of disconnect a little bit. And so that's on the normal end of the continuum. But consider this, have you ever had the experience driving where all of a sudden you realize, hey, I haven't been paying attention to the road really well, and you start to look around and you get a sense of like, I feel a little disconcerted when I do that. So I dissociated a little bit. And when I had the realization of it, it was unsettling, like, oh man, how much was I paying attention to the road? So that's on that continuum of dissociation that's kind of in the normative range, which then can start to move into the, where it becomes a little bit disruptive. The other benefit is just to get some distance from things that are emotionally difficult, right? So engaging in books, movies, games, we can kind of get absorbed in them, and that gives us some space, right? And there's something healthy about that. So that's one way. There's a bit of a choice. Another is a reflexive, like something happens, like there's a car accident or a death in the family, and there's kind of a numbing that happens, and you kind of disconnect a little bit or detach a little bit, would be another way that there's a benefit and that's on that continuum again. So everywhere from where there's less disruption to where there can be some sense of feeling surreal, all the way to missing time, confusion, psychic numbing, those kinds of things could be on the further end of the continuum. So a little bit more about the functions with traumatic experiences. So the adaptive part is that getting that disconnect allows us to go about our life as if the trauma didn't happen. There's a detachment, a psychological detachment that's associated with it. There's a credible space from whatever the trauma was, and a bit of compartmentalization, kind of puts it in another space. So there's some adaptive pieces to it. And to think a little bit more about how do we think about continuum with dissociation on the healthy and the problematic side? On the healthy side, when we dissociate with some awareness, some intentionality, it's kind of time limited, short duration, and low interference. That's on the healthier end. Once it moves into a more reflexive process that's more prolonged and starts to interfere with living, then we get into more problematic space with dissociation. How might we assess this? There's a common measure called the dissociative experiences scale. And back in the 80s and 90s, multiple personality disorder and dissociation was kind of a big thing. So this is a tool that you can take a look at later to see how they operationalize it. They're sort of like, how often do you have these experiences from 0 to 100? And then you take the average score across 28 items, and that's what your dissociation score is. And so the general population normally gets a 5 on that. Mood disorders, 7 to 9. Interestingly, late adolescence and schizophrenia both followed about 16% of dissociative experience, which is also kind of curious, right? Where they have this sort of derealization, depersonalization kind of thing going on, all the way up to PTSD and then dissociative identity disorder. You can see the subscales there, and of note with the subscales, the one that seems connected most to psychosis is the experience of depersonalization and derealization. When you have time later, take a look at the scale and take a look at this slide. I can send both the scale and the slide and some of the materials. Absorption, amnesia, and depersonalization, kind of the experience that, you know, in the one example here, feeling that other people and objects are not real in some fashion would be an example of an item that's one of the key items there. So when you have time, take a look at how they operationally define it. Moving into a little bit of the role of trauma and how does it disrupt kind of the mental processes and coping, and then kind of connecting it with psychosis. So we know from all the trainings and things that there's a well-established association between child adversity and psychosis. The odds increase, and the more adverse and traumatic experiences in childhood and adolescence, the higher risk for trauma. So what might mediate this? Well, surprise, surprise, given the talk is about dissociation, there's some more recent literature backing up the idea that dissociation may be one of those psychological processes that mediates going from trauma to things like hallucinations and other psychotic experiences. So the correlation between psychosis and hallucinations around 0.46, which is pretty strong. And then you have the subscales. But even related to paranoia, global symptoms, delusions, there is some relationship there. But the stronger relationship, if you look at the bottom box, looking at dissociations as mediating, as one of the mediating variables for hallucination, the effect size is around 0.35. So that's a medium effect size. So it's not massive, but it's there enough to make a difference across multiple studies. So both of these studies are meta-analyses. So they pull together from a lot of studies and finding this kind of strong link between the experience of dissociation and hallucinations in particular, but other experiences as well. So when you look at the theories, how can we think about it? One way to think about it is that psychosis is traumatic in origin, and that is that hallucination is a decontextualized trauma flashback. So it's a decontextualized in the sense the person doesn't know where it comes from. So when the experiences happen, the abuse or whatever happened early on, memories weren't encoded or consolidated with a lot of context at the time of trauma. So when they intrude, like a flashback does, they have less awareness of where it's coming from, and it may feel like a hallucination without understanding that context. So that's one of the models, is that hallucinations are these decontextualized kind of flashbacks in a PTSD fashion. A second of the major models seems to be dissociation increases the vulnerability to psychosis. So early adversity increases the risk and sensitivity to additional adversity and traumas, thereby increasing psychosis risk. So again, it's just that building up the stress load so you have a greater chance. But even more so, the way dissociation works, so this gets to the process part. So, you know, if a person uses dissociation, or dissociation is the way to cope, by its very nature, dissociation can lead to confusion between inner and outer states, right? Because there's little memory gaps, people aren't connecting things in time and context. So if they're already having some gaps, and they have vulnerabilities like a source monitoring error, where it's already difficult to connect with, like, was that my thought or memory, or did that happen externally? Combining those things with adversity can be a pathway to psychosis. So how might this look in context? So The way they talk about this is that when a person is in a situation where fight or flight is not a really viable option, so if a person's being abused by a loved one and they're stuck there, right? They can't leave, they have this attachment, they need the person, so they really can't fight or fly, too small, need this relationship. Dissociating is a viable way to get some distance and detach from it. Likewise, if you're bullied in school, if you fight, you might get suspended. If you try to run away, same kind of thing. You may feel a similar kind of stuckness in class where dissociating is the way that seems the more viable option. So again, you have that situation where you dissociate. Blanking out like that affects the internal anchor, so that's the how. So that makes it difficult to process the emotion that goes with that trauma that happened. And it also, with all those gaps, it's hard to modify overgeneralized schema. So then the world can begin to look very unsafe. I'm in danger and I'm vulnerable. And with the gaps, there's less opportunity to correct that. And so what happens is the dissociation becomes kind of automatic and reflexive. So a lot of cues can signal dissociation. And then that creates a lot more gaps in experience. That can feel very unsettling. Combine it with other thinking errors, and you have room for psychosis to emerge. All right, so one way that this could look, take your typical adolescent. Again, we know that in adolescence, they have a little bit more derealization, depersonalization happening. So in the morning, looking at a mirror, they feel sort of unreal. And actually, by the way, if you want to create an experience of depersonalization, stare at the mirror for over a minute. Just look at yourself, and you'll get an experience of derealization that will start to happen. For someone without trauma, and without having some of the developmental trauma and other things, they might attribute to normal circumstances. I didn't sleep well, whatever, feels weird. Okay, move along with my day. Someone who has had some developmental trauma may be inclined to have more of a catastrophic interpretation. Someone's controlling my mind or something more scary, which thereby, and again, our normal maintenance cycles, we feel anxious. And then what do? I better stay home and avoid school. Someone's trying to control me. Now, the core piece of this, the developmental trauma contributes in a couple ways. One is that the derealization experience may be a bit more profound or more intense, and the trauma-related belief underneath it could drive the catastrophic interpretation. So the core beliefs that are most commonly associated with psychosis are, I am vulnerable and others are dangerous. And this comes from some of Benthal and Reed's research along these lines. So if you have the trauma, you're having the experience, and you've developed some core ways of thinking about the world, which may predispose you to these catastrophic kind of thoughts, and then you get the maintenance cycle going by safety and avoidance. So how would this look with voice hearing? So that's kind of in developing a delusion. So again, we kind of have begun to make the case that dissociation is linked to the threat system in our brain, right? So if it's used automatically, it would make sense. If I need to be on guard a lot, I need to find a way to get my threat system on guard. One way to do that is hearing voices. So the experience of hearing voices can be a rapid and effective way to turn on the threat system. So this comes from a lot of the compassion-focused literature, thereby eliciting protective strategies, dissociate, avoid, those kinds of things. In that light, voice hearing in a weird way becomes a self-protective strategy to actively kind of activate the threat system so that you routinely take extra precautions to avoid harm and or to protect yourself from overwhelming emotions. Remember, the other part of it is whatever the trauma was, the emotional baggage, if you want to call it, for lack of a better word, connected to it may be very overwhelming, and I don't want to deal with that, so I need to find a way to get away from it. So there's kind of a self-protective piece. Revisiting the other explanation is voice hearing could also be traumatic past events re-emerging, reconnected from or disconnected from a sense of self, kind of like a flashback, but without the context. And the function here, the healthy potential function, is to draw attention to experiences that are unresolved. So from some of the CFT experience, it's either turning on the threat system too much too soon, or it's your brain's way of saying, hey, this has not been resolved. We need to attend to it. But the way it's experienced is frightening, terrible, awful, so people try to avoid and don't face it. So given that, and I'm not going to go into detail here, mostly for lack of time, one of the things you can certainly start with is psychoeducation, really getting a sense of the commonness of this experience, talking with individuals, that it's common and not intrinsically harmful. And we do have some literature that can kind of talk about the commonness of unusual experiences. You can begin to work with the person around identifying cues that might trigger some of the dissociative experiences. And once doing so, you can develop a strategy to develop some grounding strategies, the kinds of strategies that help you focus in the moment, in the present, like the, look, point, name game is one, or just, using your five senses. Those are all grounding strategies. You can move into cognitive strategies to catch some of those unhelpful thinking habits. When they come up, kind of slow down the process. And then also thinking about a compassion-focused approach. We've talked about that before. How do you change the experience of voices from one of turning away and being afraid of it to mindfully paying attention to it, trying to understand its place in your total lived experience, and wondering about protective functions and another way to kind of work with it. So overall, the bottom line is that, again, coming back to a person's experience may make sense in the context of their life. So that even frightening hallucinations may have a bit of an adaptive component to it. So we want to ask about difficult life experience, normalize the role of stress and unusual experiences. It may be better understood as a normal kind of reaction once we know the full story. And this just comes back to Reid's big reframing of the question from, what's wrong with you, to kind of what happened to you, what is happening, and what do you want to see happen in the future? Kind of be the author of that change, kind of looking at it in that kind of way. So that is all I have for now. So I'm going to stop. There are some references, and I will upload this and potentially other things related to dissociation into the iEcho. So let me pause here for questions.